And so that's what we're doing tonight. We're remembering Anthony, and that makes him still here with us.
Sure.
Yeah. So I want to begin. We have our guest panelists, and we actually have first someone who's going to give a little memorial talk about Anthony. A friend of his, Tommy Damigella, is 45-year Tupperware franchise owner, one of the original distributorships. He's also currently the president of the Northern Historical Society, a former director and current vice president of the Italian Alliance. And he's a lover of the North End. He's well known in the North End. Tell you what, Tommy, wherever we go anywhere, we tell you, we meet somebody that he knows or he's related to. It's amazing. Tommy Damigella.
Thank you. This is so hard tonight to be here without Anthony, but he's here in spirit for sure. And this was our dream, to be here together to launch this book. This was his greatest work that he put together. And I'm so familiar with all his other books. So here we are together in New Haven, and where he's from. And I just wanted to share with you my personal stories. When I met Anthony, I read his first book that he published in 1998, North End, An Italian Story. And I read his preface to it, and I read about how he went to Italy. He was a young man, he toured Italy and got to go to his grandparents' town where they originated from. And that was very important to him. And also, then I find, reading his preface, that he ends up getting a job in the North End in 1978, where my family came from and where I lived at one time too. And the more I kept reading his story, I said, my God, this is my story. This is what I'm all about. This is what I love about my Italian-American heritage. It was the same thing. So I shot off an email to Anthony and told him I can't wait to meet you. And I knew he was coming to the North End to make one of his presentations, his many PowerPoint presentations on his last book. Remember, at North Bennett School? And a whole bunch of us were there that night, that day. And I can remember walking into the classroom, and he saw me. He said, Tommy? I said, Anthony? And we did the usual thing. We gave us the big Italian hug. And we've been friends ever since that moment. We just connected. And he pulled me right into all his works that he was doing at that time. All the pictures that he was taking, the transcripts that he was working with the many Italian senior citizens that he met when he worked here at the drop-in center. He was here for, I believe, for 5 years, but he met probably 3,000 of the elderly people that lived here. He knew them, and they knew him. And this is when he started to take his pictures and take the recordings, and something intuitive in his heart said that I've got to record this because someday this is going to be gone. And it's going to be, as he said, one big Italian restaurant someday. And we only have 90 today, but who's counting, right? But he knew it was coming, he knew it was going to happen. And we just became so connected as we kept telling our stories. He got to know my family story that goes back to the early 1900s when they immigrated here to the North End from Sicily. My mother was born in Sicily. So we had a lot of personal stories that we related to. Got to know Jimmy Pasto from the documentary, and we became like the three amigos. And Anthony would come up from New Haven, drive up and say, I'm coming up, I'm gonna take some more pictures. We're gonna do the before and after pictures, because he had thousands and thousands of pictures of the North End of years ago. So like the J&N one that you have on the book cover, that's Monica's right down the street here now. It's gone, but you got Monica's. It's a before and the after. And it's just a great, great experience. And when we walked around, we just was like bumping into people literally, and we're talking with our hands, so we're whacking people in Hanover Street. And we said, met a bunch of Jimmy's old friends, and Sonny and Tony DeMarco we bumped into, but we just had this whole experience of still building the story that he was putting into this final book. And it was just a great experience to keep doing it. And so we always on the phone, talking to each other, sending emails to one another, updating everything. This went on for years. And of course, he depended a lot upon some of the local historians like Vito over there with his collection of photographs. Vito, where is this photo? What street was this on? What year was it? And then he'd be talking to Nick Della Russo, the other who knows more stories about the North End, great storytellers. And this was a collaboration that Anthony put with his book together. He said, this is not my book, this is our book, because everybody that was in it was part of that story that he was telling. And he really felt strongly about that. And so He'd come up and do so many of his PowerPoint presentations. My kids went to him. He met my family. He knew all my kids. They knew him. We became family. And one of the last things I remember is that when he stayed with us, when he went to Nick's idea thing at Dante, we got to share a lot of our personal things together. But for the last 2 years, when the pandemic hit, and he had this book that he was ready to publish, and he's putting it together. Well, things got held up because paper supplies and things of that sort. So he said, what can I do? And he started putting the pictures on Facebook. And it's called The Streets That We Grew Up in the North End. And the more pictures he put up, right, Keith? And he put a little story with it. The responses he was getting, because he became the storyteller of the North End. How many grandkids responded to the pictures when they saw their nana and their nonos in those pictures? The flow of emotions was amazing. Did any of you see some of those pictures of your, I know you saw your grandfather, Keith, right? And it just was ongoing. And people said, when's the book coming out? When's the book coming out? So he already was creating this emotion about his work. And he said that if I don't do this, nobody else will do it. And this will all be lost, because all those people's voices that he recorded and transcribed and took their pictures, they're gone. They're not around anymore. But we got their stories because of Anthony. And to Jimmy's point, I remember that every time we went to his PowerPoint presentations, as Jimmy brought up, that he always saved that last slide of his dad. It's a great picture. I can still see it, like his dad is getting a pot of coffee to make some espresso. He's got the picture, his father's like a little smile on his face. He's looking just past the coffee pot. Can you picture it to me? And that's what Anthony said. Quoted his dad and said, Anthony, when I die, when I go, as long as you keep talking about me and remember who I am, I'll always be with you. That's exactly how we feel about Anthony. Because Anthony, we're always going to be talking about him. We're always going to remember him. We'll never forget him. Thank you.
So the book, as you know, was published by SUNY Press, and I wanted to have the editor of the press come and speak to us tonight, James Peltz. He's writes books in Asian studies, religious studies, Jewish studies, and of course, Italian studies. He's coming up on his 30th year at the press. He's been to Boston before because his daughter went to Wellesley and his son is finishing up at Boston University. So he made the trip many times, and we welcome you. Thank you. Thanks so much.
An epilogue to the book, but also for stepping in and helping to do the page proofs and the copy of the manuscript and answer questions about names and designs to make sure that. Thank you so much for your. And I want to thank my colleague Jen Bennett-Gentner, who's given over with me today. She's the production editor for the book. So if you like the way it looks, she's the one who made it look as good as it does. And she's also going to keep me away from the job. Thanks, Tommy, for your and thanks Ian Books for providing space in this wonderful event. Thanks so much. So Anthony and SUNY Press. Well, the first thing you have to know about university presses is we don't publish books that usually make money to sell copies. Anthony's was an exception. I'll talk a bit about the Italian American experience at New Haven, which is the first book I worked on with Anthony. The original book proposal for the book came in May 2003. And yeah, it was interesting since the series editor of our Italian American Studies series, Fred Gardafe, he said, this looks interesting. So Anthony and I worked on it. You know, it took about 3 years following peer review and revisions, copy editing, typesetting, and adding yet another photograph that Anthony had found that he thought would be be perfect for the book. Anthony's always finding another photograph or another story that would be perfect for the book. So anyway, it was finally published in July 1st, 2006. And I don't think any of us at the press were prepared for what happened. The first week after publication, we sold 638 copies, which is frankly more than most of our books sell. And when I say we sold, what I really mean was Anthony sold. Here's an excerpt from an email Anthony sent on July 5th, 2006. Since the newspaper article about the book appeared in the New Haven Register, I've been getting all kinds of phone requests for the book. One guy called me and bought 12 the other day. Another family bought 8. There's so many people connected to the elders and storytellers in the book, grandchildren, nephews, cousins, friends. I'm confident this is a lot of books. Another one 2 weeks later on July 17th. James, the phone is ringing off the hook here at home. I met an old friend I used to work with this morning for coffee. She bought 6 books for her and some of my old friends between New Haven and New York. I used to work in Campania. We're sitting and talking and I'm signing away. This guy walks over and says, "Hey, I know you. You're Anthony Riccio. Do you have any more books?" Luckily, I had more in the car. So the book went on to sell over 4,000 copies in its first year. An additional 1,200 copies before it was released in paperback in 2009. Which has then gone on to sell almost another 1,000 copies. So, over 6,000 copies sold and still selling. It's the best-selling book that I've ever personally acquired. And it's a testament, I think, to not only Anthony, but the support of the community that came out for the book. It was my pleasure to work on 4 more books with Anthony. And each of those had its own story, but I want to share an email he wrote to his production editor, Lori Searle, when we were still working on that first book. It reveals something about his character, his essential kindness and graciousness that made him such a pleasure to work with. He was trying to set something up with the university, something called a master's team. When the master of one of the 12 residential colleges invites a notable non-academic guest to speak to students. It's a pretty big deal, especially if you're a kid up who grew, as Anthony said, across the tracks in New Haven, which I understand has a pretty strong town-down split. The original plan was to try to schedule something in April, and Lori, the production editor, was really stressing about being able to get the book to the printer in time. So Anthony wrote to her, "Lori, if you're putting all this pressure on yourself to get this book out for the master's team, please take a deep breath and listen to me. There is absolutely no rush to get the book out before publication. I've just had a nice conversation with the master's staff, and he rightly suggested, and I agree with him, have the lecture in the fall. It's having on the week of the 17th. It's cutting up way too close to exams. The students will not just be able to just not be able to attend. Besides, by the fall, so many of those students will know my work that will really be well attended. And who knows, there may be more of these master's teams. We've quite a few of the masters at the various colleges that we have on the work. This is how I feel about the first week of April deadline. I've waited 8+ years to see what's taking place. So what's another few weeks? There's simply no pressure on this. Please don't put any unnecessary pressure on yourself, your staff, or the printer. So, Lori, if you are setting all these deadlines up just because of the team, please reconsider and take your time. I think we're in a slower place to allow all of us to produce a great book." That's what it was like to work with this team. It was our honor and privilege to do this.
I just mentioned we will have an opportunity after we have questions and discussion. I also want to extend to James and to Jim, we really have appreciation, Nick, Tommy, myself, and the other Nick here, all of us. And it was just a pleasure to work with you. I felt we became friends and colleagues just over the internet. It's our first time meeting, so thank you. It means a lot to us. Our next speaker is Lorraine Mangione. She is a professor with clinical psychology in Antioch University in Keene, New Hampshire, where she trains doctoral students. She's also done research on Italian daughters who lost their fathers. And she's doing research now on Bruce Springsteen's Bruce Springsteen's female fans, some of whom are Italian, but Bruce Springsteen is half Italian. And she grew up in what town?
Southington, Connecticut, just down the street from New Haven.
From New Haven. She said Italians were the norm in her town. Now she lives in Northampton, where Italians supposedly were there a long time ago, right? And so she seeks them out wherever she can find them.
My daughter says I stalk Italians every time, Italians or Italian Americans every time I hear them, and she's kind of right. So, I feel honored to be here, and thank you, Jim and others. So I'm going to start with the themes of my talk. I'm going to just put the themes out there right at the beginning. Relationship and connecting, authenticity and commitment to what is real, generosity of spirit, and reflective capacity. And you won't be quizzed on those at the end. Anthony was always thinking in terms of relationships and connections, always connecting people up. He was so real and genuine. He was his true self with no airs, with a sense of humility despite his amazing gifts and accomplishments. He was still so humble. He gave freely of himself, his knowledge, his network, etc. And he could drill down into details of a text, yet also step back and see and appreciate the more expansive picture, often asking questions or adding a perspective that others hadn't thought of. All of these qualities, to me, make for a compelling storyteller and oral historian. And I've always felt he was a psychologist in his own right. And I think that's one of the reasons we became such good friends. We first met at the American Psychological Association annual convention in 2008 in Boston, where Anthony was a speaker at an event put on by the Italian American Psychologists Association, along with, I'm so glad you got here, Via More. Can you raise your hand? Artist, sculptor, poet, and writer. I'm so thrilled you're here since I met the two of you together. For any of us who might have thought about the North End solely in terms of a tourist destination for excellent cannoli, we were ushered into a history and wealth of just humanity of the Italian North End by Anthony that night. And that was so helpful to get over the like, let's just go get, nothing wrong with cannoli, but let's just go get cannoli. It was like, this is who populated the North End. He taught us that. He and I cemented our relationship through my research and writing of my book, Daughters, Dads, and the Path Through Greek, Tales from Italian America, with Donna DiCello. And I often wonder, would I ever even have done that book if I hadn't known Anthony? He was always connecting me with one place or another to find Italian American women to interview. Lorraine, you've got to go talk to this person. To share my research on the book with different groups, Lorraine, just call this person. Often telling me just to say, Anthony told me to call. He was as enthusiastic about my work as I was about his, and he wanted to get both out to the world. He was always concocting, you know how he was, different plans and possibilities, always eager to talk about his work or promote those of us writing about the Italian American experience. He opened up a world for me, quite honestly. His excitement about the world was palpable. He was a man on a mission, as you all know, and I so wish he were here for the next project I plan on doing in the Italian American research, because he would have had so much to say about it. And sometimes I would just mention, because Chef Silvio was mentioned, sometimes that mission included food. And his work with Chef Silvio down in Connecticut was just amazing. And again, we ended up, after meeting Chef Silvio, bringing my whole family to his restaurant and just being treated wonderfully. Again, all through Anthony and his capacity to connect. So I'm going to tell you 3 brief stories. A few months after first meeting, Anthony insisted I come to an event in New Haven on the water, a very fancy spot. If anybody knows New Haven, you probably know where this was. Very fancy. I think it was a celebration of Italian Heritage Month. It was in October, and also his book on New Haven. My daughter, Alessandria, was just starting high school and was with me, as I had schooled her on all things Italian from early on. It was a very moving and festive event, and when Anthony came to speak with us at the end, when it was done, he quickly got a gleam in his eye, you know how he does that gleam, and escorted us up to where Rosa DeLauro, the United States Congresswoman from New Haven, was, still chatting with some folks at the end there. He insisted that Alessandria and Rosa meet, and he did it so graciously. I remember him saying to Alessandria, so she's like a 14-year-old kid, you have to come meet someone. It was a shining moment. My kid, who had just been studying civics in school, getting to personally meet and talk with Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro. It made an impression on her. It was exciting for all of us. I don't think Rosa had her purple hair back then yet. She has purple hair a lot, but she was just so warm and engaging. And maybe it planted the seeds for Alessandria to do a Senate internship after college. Who knows? From that beginning, Rosa ended up being interviewed for my daughter's and dad's book, again through Anthony's connections, talking eloquently about her father, also in politics, and how much he influenced her to go into politics. The second story also involves my daughter on a college trip to Yale. My choice that we go visit there because I wanted her to see a somewhat bigger and more urban school. And Anthony had talked about how she definitely needed to come down and see it. You know how he is. He couldn't say enough good things about Yale. However, it wasn't the best tour. Alessandria wasn't in the best frame of mind for it. Mama, look it, we're in the city. And when we got to Sterling Library and contacted him, like we had arranged, Anthony saw right away that she wasn't being won over. He said, skip the tour. I'll give you a better one. And proceeded to bring us through the dark, labyrinthine basement and back rooms of Sterling Library for the most amazing tour imaginable, with his rarefied knowledge, his intense energy, explaining archives, special things, and just some old, interesting, I'll just call it stuff. He could also talk about the wonderful students with whom he had worked for years, but none of it. She did not apply to Yale, no interest. But we left having spent a remarkable time with Anthony, and we knew Yale Library secrets, and we felt quite dazzled. The third story takes place in Southington, Connecticut, my hometown, where I'd gotten Anthony connected to a few women who were true Southingtonites from way back, and also introduced him to a very beloved Italian teacher from my high school, Alphonse D'Angelo, who was part of and knew that history really well. So that's this book. This is the one I have the most emotional connection to. And I would say Anthony was always interested in the forgotten ones, and women were often the forgotten ones. So that this is just about women is really special. He was deep. We were all in Southington at Franny DeFeo's grandmother's house. He was deep into interviewing a couple of these women whose families had come to Southington in the early part of the 20th century, and they could tell great stories of this communal oven and baking bread together. Everybody had to bring their bread to the communal oven, and other early immigrant experiences. I was spellbound and thrilled just to be allowed into this conversation at this woman's kitchen table and just watching him work. It was incredible. Then he turned to me and asked me about my mother, both her experience as well as my experience growing up with my mother. I sat there speechless, not expecting to talk about my mom, not expecting to be any part of the interview at all, and also not knowing if it was appropriate because my mother was a Brooklynite. She was from Brooklyn, not a Southingtonite. I mean, I don't know if I can say this here. She was a Brooklyn Dodgers fan. Is that okay? All right. Yeah. So we were interlopers. We hadn't moved to Southington until the 1950s. So I had nothing of the stories those other people had. But you know, Anthony, he persisted. No, Lorraine, tell me more, tell me. And I did say a few things, and they are in the book. And I have to say, I was just so delighted after all that to have my mother and the significance of our relationship, which was critical. My mother was the first psychologist in the family, although she never had that degree. That's how I became a psychologist. So I'm really happy that it's in there. But boy, he had to work hard to get that out of me. But you know, he would do that, right? So as I wrap up, I want to mention one way in which his valuing of authenticity, because you all remember my themes, right, stood out. And that was the fact that he had to transcribe his interviews himself. He knew no one else could ever get all the nuance, dialect, the meaning, the deep meaning that he would get from the tapes. I have done several qualitative research projects in my life, and in my mind, transcribing is an excellent job for a research assistant. Not for Anthony. He felt a profound obligation to be true and faithful to the people who opened their homes and hearts to him. It's going to make me cry. He also knew that he was in a race against time, as some other people have mentioned, as the older generations were fading. But he had to do the transcribing himself. He had to get at what they really meant. So again, the generosity, the relationships, the authenticity, the reflectiveness, and as I wrote this and thought about this, I'm just going to add a sense of the sacred, I feel, was always there for him. Whatever the topic, there was a sense of the sacred, all there. I was going to end with the same quotation because I actually have that quotation from his dad on page 179 in my Daughters and Dads book. And that was so important to me because these women that I interviewed were all had all lost their dads. And so to hear from his dad about how to keep them alive, how to keep their dads alive, seemed like such an important thing. And I'm always so grateful to him for that quotation. Thank you.
Thank you, Elaine, very much. It's, my connection with Anthony was through the North, and that's how I know him. It's nice to hear, but knowing him, before the North End or apart from the North End.
Although it started with the North.
It started,
Yeah,
yes.
it definitely started with the North.
And it's interesting how, Anthony brought us together as friends and brings so many people together. And so we're now coming to the North End, Anthony coming to the North End. And one of the people who knew Anthony in the North End was our next speaker, Robert LaRocca. He's been retired now from working state government for 11 years. Before that, he was a community leader, worked in many different community organizations in the North End. And I want to mention, for a lot of us guys growing up in the North End, Robert is really important for us. He was an important figure to give us an alternative path, a way off the streets and out of the streets, a way to think about life and a sort of a different world out there. So he has his own story to tell. I just want to mention, I hope someday he tells it and writes it. But now he's going to tell us about his meeting Anthony in the North End.
Robert and Stephen are going to be my
You want to stand there so you're on that side?
So, I feel almost odd. Yeah, that's me. That's it. I'll explain that. I feel almost odd up here because I'm going to coin a new term, BA, before authorship. So that's when I really knew Anthony. In 1976, I was on a selection committee for a youth coordinator at the North End Community Action Program, which was a branch of Action for Boston Community Development. And in the middle of the interviewing process, the director, Jim Amalfitano, stopped the interview and said, I'm going to bother you when you just stop this interview. I want you for that position. So ultimately, I took the position, made some deals. And he had told me that, he says, I have file cabinets full of applicants for 2 positions because Action for Boston Community Development put a job ad for these positions in the Boston Globe. So people from all over New England had applied. So he says, I have hundreds of applications. So for your position, well, it became my position. And I agreed with them ultimately. And the senior coordinator. So that's when I met Anthony. I met him before authorship. So I can tell you what we ate, what we did, what we talked about, the fun we had. I can't be elegant and, about any authorship. But I do know that the gentleman that was very, very important behind the scenes for Anthony and I see another friend, and the two friends in the back, Paul and Anthony, was Jim Amalfitano. He was director of the Action for Boston Community Development Program. Came from South Boston. He was a consultant for ABCD. And we moved from Parmenter Street to Prince Street. Space was very important in the North End. We rented a hall, the St. Anthony's Hall. And the first floor was the senior citizen program. Second floor was the administrative offices of Jim Amalfitano. And the third floor was the youth program, which I ran. And Jim was like a walking Zen master. He was just this incredible guy that had this focus, magnanimity, and generosity that was incomparable. And Anthony and I attached ourselves to him. You know, we would sit down and have a brainstorming meeting, and Anthony and I would come up with 1 or 2 ideas, and Jim would come up with about 10. And, you know, we'd look at each other, and we laughed a lot. We had a lot of fun. We laughed a lot. We went to Pal's lunch, and we had Pasto with Dikya, you know, Endicott Street stuff, shells. But the most important thing I think I can relate to is when Anthony started doing his survey of the senior citizens, going to flats and coming back to the meetings with Jim and I, and he'd say, you know, it's Nicolina's house, and there's no bathroom. The bathroom's in the, you know, in the hallway. And I remember growing up like that with the bathroom in the hallway. We shared it until my grandfather renovated the building. And Jim Amalfitano is the one that said, Anthony, you have a gold mine here. You know, I was a little jealous. You know, why does he have a gold mine? You know, but I had gold mines. Guys like Robert and Steve who worked in the program and became very successful adults. Robert's, you know, retiring soon. So that's my impression of Anthony. You know, he ate a lot of bananas and rode his bike to Connecticut. You know, he'd ride to 200 miles. He was in excellent health. And we had a lot of fun. But the major important thing was the way he related to people and how he changed my life. He was a couple of years younger than me. And I saw him kind of as a younger brother. I selected this photo of myself because my mother saw it once and says, well, you look pretty good there. You know, 7 kids and you get a compliment. So, but he, you know, here's the strangeness of it. When he had his camera, he was like a Svengali. It was really, really strange. So, you know, before that time, I was in my mid-20s. So we met each other like around 1976, right up here. You know, we started in Parmenter and moved to Prince Street. So, you know, he said, Bobby, you know, in his Connecticut accent, Bobby, I'm going to take a picture of you. I'm going to bring my camera in and I'm going to take a photograph. So that started on a Monday. Tuesday, the same thing. Wednesday, the same thing. Thursday, the same thing. You know, all right, Anthony, take the photograph. You know? So he brought in on Friday, came in with his camera, and he says, I have the camera, Bob. And for some reason, I was excited. He just came into my world, brought me in his world, and he says, I'm going to take the picture. So, you know, it's okay. And he says, you know what we're going to do? We're going to go up the roof because it's a 2-story building. Probably, is it still there? I think it's a parking lot. No, it's a parking lot. So it's a 2-story building. We went up to the roof. So I said, oh, this is adventurous. So exciting. We're going to take a picture on the roof. So, and then he starts talking to me about the North End. He goes, look, Bobby, look out there, Bobby. And, you know, I went to St. Anthony's School. I went to Christopher Columbus High School, right in the area from Prince Street. You can see it. I worked at the North End Bathhouse. I played at the North End Bathhouse. I was the chairman of the committee, you know, so on and on and on. And it was like he had me mesmerized. Look at Bobby, look at this. So I saw it from a different perspective. You know, this is the honest truth. And I was standing up there after living there and working there all my life. And he said, Bobby, we're going to do this. And then he started snapping pictures. So I don't know. I mean, you can see the handkerchief sticking out of my pocket. It's just memorialized in my mind. It just signifies our deep friendship, the commitment that he had, you know, just before he passed, you know, sure. just before he passed.
Which one is you?
You're bad. You're bad. The guy with the big arms. Look at those.
Those are small. I lost 40 pounds.
Those are
And that
guns.
was take- So, before he passed, he would call me up and he'd say, Bobby, finally it's coming to fruition, Bobby. Sometimes he called me Bronx because, we drove to New York on Sunday just to go for a ride and go to a lecture. And he said, Bobby, it's coming to fruition. And he says, I'm so thrilled. I have Jimmy Pasto and Nick Dalrus doing the epilogue and prologue. And he was, this was during Christmas time and I said, why is he keeps mentioning this over and over and over. It was almost becoming annoying to a point. I'm so happy. It's from the North End. And I have Jimmy Pasto and Nick Dalrus. I was like, Anthony, I know that. I know those guys. They're great writers. They're great ride. One of the guys we go for breakfast all the time. And, then I got the news from Tom called. It was a very, very, very sad day for me, he passed. But here we are. And I remember a conversation I had with Jimmy. I said, it was almost, some people, they touch your soul. It was almost as if he was telling me, how important you two guys were. He knew on some level. I was just talking to Nick, he knew he was sick. He came to the North End once, the North End Library. He did a presentation there. And he was ill. And he left. He says, Bobby, I got to go get some juice, take over. So I'm standing up, trying to do his job, I know Anthony before authorship. And, I knew some of the pictures and some of the scenes and some of the storylines, but, he became so eloquent and so focused. But that's my story of Anthony. It's more of a personal story. Thanks for coming.
I just want to mention though, Bob, whenever Anthony spoke about you, something changed in his voice. You meant a lot to him too, really. And I could always tell when he spoke to you. There was a kind of awe as well when he spoke about him. Yeah. Our next speaker, Gwen Cordonaway, is an associate director at Boston University's writing program. She's my colleague there. Her research and her teaching is on cultural studies, on genre awareness. Gwen also wrote a wonderful, insightful review of Anthony's first book in our North End Journal, Journal of the North End Historical Society, which I think is available here in the bookstore. Really good review, and she's going to speak to us about Anthony's photographs.
Thanks, Dan.
Stay on that side.
Stay on this side. Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm so honored to be here to talk about Anthony as a photographer, as represented both in his collection From Italy to the North End and photographs and stories, streets, and saints. I like that trouble that it draws from. I'm sad to say that unlike so many people in the room, I never got to meet Anthony in person. We did email quite a bit, and I tried to meet him in person a couple of times, but we were thwarted by things like my newborn and travel and ultimately the pandemic. But while I regret that we could never connect in person, I feel really grateful for the privilege to have connected to him through his photography and that he's allowing me to connect with you as well. So now I'm going to out myself if my name and my affect is not already. I'm not Italian, like I should just say it. The Welsh first name and Ukrainian last name gave me away. But I actually think that it's my status as an outsider to this community that helps me see something special in the photographs that's a little bit different from some of the migration photography and documentary photography that I've looked at in other contexts in the courses I teach. Anthony's book, I think, participates in the important work of documenting the stories and experiences of immigrants at key moments of transition. This is work that we need to keep doing from migrant populations that continue to shape and continuously reshape our city. And so I think he made a really important contribution here. When I think about the photos in Stories, Streets, and Saints, I think that it's clear that in his contribution, there are kind of three thematic lines that we can follow, and I'll try not to get too teacherly on you, but every now and then I'll say, do you remember this thing? And I'll return to it. So the first is portraits, the second is places, and the third is pairings. I think it's important to make the distinction because it might seem like Anthony's photography is personal, and I think it is. And I think it's also a kind of documentary photography that's worth paying special attention to. So Anthony himself wanted to think of this as a mosaic, he writes in the book, the way in which the oral histories and the photographs work together. And so I'm going to be thinking too about the way in which these photographs, this handful of photographs that I'm going to share with you, create a kind of mosaic, and also maybe give you a glimpse of what's inside the book so that you get as excited about it as everybody else. So first, portraits. I think the portraits are the signature images that Anthony shares of the North End community in his photography. And they're particularly poignant for a few reasons. For one, it's that intimacy between the photographer and the subject that is clear already in everything everyone's been saying. In many cases, Anthony uses gaze very strategically to communicate something that he's uniquely privy to. The background is blurred, as in this photograph of Josie Tranquillo. The subject fills the frame, and I don't know, warmth just radiating out of this photograph. Isn't she lovely? Isn't she lively, right? And don't you get that sense from the photograph that part of that loveliness comes from her connection to Anthony, right? Like her connection in the moment of the photograph. Next picture, thanks. So, or take this image of Alberto Sorrentino. Again, the background isn't glamorous. I love your comment about there's a handkerchief coming out of your pocket. Well, there's a rolled up tissue on the ground here, right? Yeah, Anthony, and you probably can, if you're a local insider, I bet you know exactly where this bench was or is. I'm not, so I don't. But see the way that Alberto is leaning forward. See how his arm extends past the end of the frame here. See how he's taking up so much space. He's sort of working that connection with Anthony. And I'll just have you notice, this is one of the teacher moments. Notice the square that his arm is making here. There's a kind of square going on here. More about that. Hold that in your brain for a second. Next slide, please. So a lot of the portraits are warm and inviting like those two, but there are also many that begin to get at some of the urgent concerns for the community, particularly the gentrification that was starting to take over the neighborhood during this time that was mentioned in the beginning, at the twilight of the Italian immigrant generation in Boston. When change came again, as first and second generation Italian Americans dispersed, moved up and out, and so forth. In this photograph, which is titled heartbreakingly Rosa Vera at the time of her eviction, the subject is standing close to the photographer, but she's also detached. She's gazing off to the side of and beyond the frame in a way that communicates generational hardships, loneliness that she talks about in her oral history as well, that her family has dispersed. She's kind of like the last one left, and just deep loss. And that's something that Anthony was desperate to include in the telling of the stories of North End residents as change came, not for the first time and not for the last, for the neighborhood. Which brings us to place, which is another strong thread in the photographs. Having grown up, as you've heard or know, in New Haven, Anthony was both a traveler and an insider here in the Boston enclave, and that may have given him some unique perspective on the spaces and places of the neighborhood, which I think we've heard in people's stories. Some of the place-focused shots function as portraits too, like this beautifully composed photograph of Frank Carolla in his shoe shine shop. I love the way that we feel like we're standing kind of on the threshold of the shop, like where else could we stand? There aren't that many places to stand. It's what we might call a portrait in place, with its clear attention to composition and obvious setup, Frank had to climb up into his chair. He's putting his arm just so, looking straight at the camera. And you start to get a sense of how Anthony's interest in what he calls in the acknowledgements to the book, by way of thanking Nick for his contributions, the neighborhood mosaic that would have been lost to history comes through in the choices he's making here as a photographer. So I'm going to do it again. Often when he's photographing building interiors and exteriors, Anthony centers rectangles. So see if you can find them. The reflective rectangle here, the shoe inserts, the arm of the chair, his apron, and so on. So again, keep looking for those squares and rectangles, which are like imperfect pieces that would make a mosaic, right? Okay, here's another charmingly posed place-based portrait, this time of Antonio and Filomena Pugnale dumping grapes into a homemade electric grape masher in their cellar. This image reaches back to Anthony's photos from the 70s in his earlier book that I reviewed, where he travels to rural Italy and he's really intent on capturing the kind of practices, the day-to-day practices of the people there, including making wine. At the same time that there's a kind of anthropological interest in this one, there's also that sense that Anthony's been welcomed into their cellar. So a real kind of warmth there. And the Pugnales are looking directly at the camera, waiting with their hands in a crate full of grapes, like deep in the juice as it's dripping. They really want this moment preserved too. So there's a kind of participation of everybody involved of wanting to say that. And in the oral history, they mentioned our children couldn't come tonight to help us with the grapes. They're too busy working. And there's a kind of sadness around this process being a kind of becoming a lonely one, I think is really touching. Thank you. So I know it's like one more of these place-based ones. I'll go quickly because it's so hard to choose. But I love this picture so much. It puts us in between interior and exterior. When you start to get to know his photos, he's got both interior and exterior interests. Unlike the two previous place shots, here we get the sense that the photographer is more like a witness, a little bit outside of an exchange. The rectangles, I bet you can find some now. You're getting good at it. But one of them that I love is made by this gesture of this is Helen Longo. This is her tenant. The tenant is touching her skirt. I think this is just such a beautiful, beautiful gesture to capture. And again, it's sort of that gesture actually makes one of these little mosaic tiles that you might see. Okay, finally the pairing. So I've kind of just selected two sets of photographs to pair so that you can look at them side by side. Anthony loved windows. Windows were interesting for interiors and exteriors. And you'll notice that here's an interior, here's an exterior. In the interiors, the subjects are so often gravitating towards the windows. And in the style of housing, of course, there's a window only on one side, right? So sort of this gravitational pull towards the street, towards the light, towards the air. And then when you're outside, the windows become a sort of a frame for a subject, like a little picture frame inside the picture. Inside the window puts Tom Bardetti in the shade. He's sort of like a sunset, he's sort of disappearing, right? And that's, I think, what makes the photo feel sad, poignant. On the other hand, Antonio Tanzillo is outlined in that deep, dark black of the inside of her house. Is almost like that velvet background you see in an old portrait of a royal person. And so it's both, right? It's both mosaic, it's both portrait, and it's kind of this disappearance that I think when you put them together, you can see from the inside and the outside. So there's a desire to preserve from the outside, but it signals an imminent loss from the inside. And then the last one, and then I'll stop talking. So I want to end by, oh, the same store, yeah. I read the book. I want to end by considering once more that mosaic that I've been talking about. So in the previous photos and in this inviting shot of Helen Balsandro at the Saint store, those rectangles, again, they're just infinite in this picture, right? Like you can find them, they're prayer cards and placards and every kind of thing you can think of. Next to it, core property group, which took over the space. Rectangles again, but they're not infinitely varied. They're replicated, right? There's something so repeated about them. The rectangles in the earlier portraits, and James writes about this space here. So if you at the epilogue of the book, so you can read more about that particular circumstance there. But the rectangulars in the earlier portraits and place-based photos are sometimes windows and doors, but they're also gestures and worn objects. So in Helen's shop, there are placards, prayer cards, shelves filled to overflowing. The edge of the counter made soft by Helen's touch. It's even being made soft by her touch in the picture. It's a process. Do you remember the gesture between the two women making a square? The unnamed tenant touching Helen Wonga's skirt. Do you remember the paper calendar above Tom Bardetti's head in that shot? Do you remember the crate of grapes, the grape masher, the shoe inserts? Can you see that mosaic? Because Anthony wanted you to see it. And he offers this collection as a gift to help you do just that, fulfilling the hopes of Mary Molinari, his friends and his friend and neighborhood resident, who in 1980 said to him, Anthony, I hope you make something out of all this. I hope you make a book so people won't forget.
I think of Anthony's photos, I look at them for emotion. And so you remind us, he's a remarkable photographer. Who teach us and show us how he was looking at these things. So thank you, it was very interesting. And a final guest, not last but not least, not at all. But Anthony's book, one addition to this book, some of the photographs in here were in his previous book. It was largely a book of his photos, but this contains the oral histories. And Nick is going to talk about that. He's an oral surgeon, lifelong North Ender. He wrote a wonderful set of articles called Life on the Corner for northendwaterfront.com. I hope someday another push for another book that he puts them together and publishes them. It's very, very important collection of history of the North End. So Nick, I'll turn it over to you. Do you want to do?
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I want to start first by saying hello to some of my old friends who I see here. Joe, Tony, you sent me an email today. Nice to see you. Rita May, Vito, Stephen, if I left anybody else. These are the people I grew up with here in the North End. 1 month before the end of World War II, I was born right here on Salem Street, about a block and a half away. My father had just come home from World War II, and we lived in a building that was owned by Joe Tecci. Some of the people would know Joe. He owned a restaurant. He was a character.
Oh, yes.
He was a character in a
I know
house.
his daughter,
Do you really?
Maria Elena.
No, Jacqueline was his daughter.
No, she's her, yeah,
Okay, anyway.
definitely.
And there were 4 of us living in 3 rooms. We were evicted when Joe's brother came home from the Korean War, and we moved over here to Salem Street again, right over there, right next to Helen Wonga, who you just spoke about. So I knew a lot of the people there. From the time I was born until today, I've lived in the North End. So I've lived here an awful long time. In fact, from about 1895 until today, a member of my immediate family has always lived in the North End. It started with my great-grandmother, Conchetta Manfra, my grandparents who came here from Italy around the late 1890s. My father and my mother were both born here. I lived here with my grandfather. My 5 daughters, 2 of whom are here. Emily and Jessica, here in the North End. And now my grandson is here, lives here. So we've lived here an awful long time.
my roots go very deep into this neighborhood, a neighborhood I love. And that's what my role was in Anthony's book, because Anthony, who I never met Anthony. I never met him because of the COVID epidemic. But I spoke to him on the phone and the constant emails that went back and forth. And to be honest, I was getting a little bit annoyed. And I would try to pawn it off on Vito or Victor or Sonny or somebody else and say, look, I'm going to give you somebody's name today. Vito's name. Just because I had a practice I had to take care of. I didn't have time for this. So my role was filling in the granular details that Anthony, who really never lived here, wouldn't know. And let me tell you who picked my brain. It was constant. Nick, where's this? And who's this person? Who's that person? The people in the book are really from my grandparents' generation, but I knew a lot of them by face, and I remember them. I walked up here tonight from my house, which is now on the other side of the North End. And I have to tell you, it wasn't easy. It was sort of sad, because as I walked through the streets, I didn't recognize anybody. 75 years ago, 70 years ago, I would have known everybody. Yeah. I would have stopped and I would have said hello to so many people. And now I was happy to see families, suburban people. I was happy to see families. I was happy to see the restaurants full and everybody was enjoying themselves and having a good time. But it ain't the same as when I was a kid. So I got to thinking, I don't know how many people Anthony actually interviewed here in the North End, but it was only a small number of the total people who lived here. And a week ago, knowing that I was coming here, I was thinking about how many people have lived in the, I'm going to call it the Italian North End, say from 1895 until 1995. And I'm going to ask, how many people total do you think lived in the North End during those 100 years?
Well, going back to 1895, I would
Yeah.
say there was only maybe 5,000 Italians because at
Right,
the time there
it was
three
like a,
different
it
groups,
was like a
Italians,
bell
Jews,
curve, right?
Jewish,
It came,
and,
yeah, right,
and then it was up to 30,000, 40,000. So I
at one time.
have to say
Yeah, I think the
20,000.
number was 36 at one time.
Well, that's not a bad guess, but it's not a right guess. But it's a good guess. It's a good guess. And it's not an easy number to come up with. You would think it is, and you could just go to the census, but the census is done once every 10 years. And, a lot changes in between. So what I did was I went to the BRA website, and right now the North End has 5,200 living units. That's right, 5,200 units. So 5,200 units. Now it had maybe more or less when I was a kid. Now there are people who live on the wharves and we have our towers. But before, when I was young, the Central Artery wasn't there. There were some houses there, and so it varied over the years. But I said, let me just go with the BRA estimate. There were 5,200 living units. So 5,200 units, 100 years. So that's 520,000 units. Now, how many people lived in each of those units? Well, when I was young, my father's father and mother had 10 kids. So we were 12 in that family. My mother's father and mother had 8 kids. So they were 10 in that family, 12 in the previous family. So there were an awful lot of kids, and there were houses. I remember speaking to Roger Mastoni, who you know, and he lived on Sheep Street. And Roger said that just in his building, well, just in Roger's building, there were like 40 kids, 40, maybe even more. I mean, that's an enormous number of people. So we have 520,000, and how many people live in each unit? Well, over the 100 years, there were lots early, and then there were not as many. But even if we said there were 4 people per unit, you come up with 2 million people. Now, a lot of those people are counted several times, like me. I would be counted every year for 75 years, you see? But still, it's an awful lot of people. Now, imagine if even half of those people bought this book. What would you think? Well, I enjoy writing it. I wrote the first chapter, and I wrote it sort of roughly as a history of my family, but I took a lot of literary excursions. And I hope you all read it, and I hope you all enjoy it. And I would love to hear from you. You can send an email. My daughter has my email address. And you all have stories to tell. Everyone who lives in the North End, all of those hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people have stories to tell. It's a wonderful story.
And I remember when Anthony would call me and tell me, I spoke to Nick, he told me so much, Jim, he told me this and he told me that. So thank you all very much. We'd like to open it up now to comments, to questions.
I just got a quick story on Anthony. Like we all did, we got numerous emails, constantly getting emails. And he says, I owe you a cup of coffee. He owed me about 700 coffees. So one of the stories he called me, like, I got this, I saw a picture you put on the somewhere, you know, and there was two men in front of Hal's Lunch. He says, Anthony, yeah, that's your picture. It is? Yeah. I says, that the one of them owns another, there's another picture you have. It's his banana place that was Anastasio brothers. I said, the two guys was Joe, Papa Joe Origo, and they Anastasio on it. He didn't even know. He forgot that he had that picture.
So again, a question, anyone have any questions for our panelists or comments, share a story?
I'm curious, Gwen, right? Do you think Anthony, when he took his picture, just saw something that he liked the way it looked and snapped it, or was he looking for something in particular, like you talk about on the mosaics and the rectangles?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's sort of like gets to what Bobby was saying about like, you know, it seems like he's just taken a picture of someone, but there's so much thought going into it, composition, thinking about the space around him. I was really happy to hear that story because that's been my sense, although I can't know exactly what Anthony was thinking in 1981, right? But it seems to me over the body of work, especially if you look at the previous book where it's mostly photographs, that there are these themes that run through, like he's clearly favoring particular angles and he's clearly trying to capture things in a particular way, and he has a style, right? He's an artist in that approach. But I think it's tricky because for me too, I'm always like, is it documentary? Is it personal? Because it's so personal to him and to the subjects. Like it's not just personal because he cares deeply about it. He has buy-in from the people. And there's some photos in the previous book that are taken like in urban settings where he doesn't know the people, and they're different. Like, they're interesting too. And actually, they have a lot of rectangles too.
Like this man, he copied his face was dark. You think
That's
that was to capture that, like you talked about that sadness.
The melancholy. I
Disappearing.
think so. Yeah, I think so. He could certainly, and that's the move, right? You know?
If I can make a comment. I always thought that Anthony's great genius was his ability to draw the stories out of these old people. I can tell you from my own family, my grandmother and grandfather, both my father's side and my mother's side, but they didn't speak English well at all. But they were so hesitant to talk about the old country. They were very hesitant to talk about the trip over, which was horrific. Horrific. My grandmother told me, and there were tears in her eyes when she talked about being seasick. These are just girls, young teenage girls from the hill towns in Italy. They never saw the ocean. And now they're put on a ship in the bowels of the ship. And they were seasick the entire time over. And they had to fend off the advances of the crews of the ship that would try to get them and do things to them. And it was a horrible, horrible experience. And she put it on, right out of her mind. But Anthony was able to get them, and they were enthusiastic about telling the stories to him. I tried for years to get my father, my mother, my grandmother, grandfather, and They was like a little bit, but not really. They didn't want to talk about it. I don't know if that was your experience, Joe, or your experience, but that was certainly.
The funny thing, in Anthony's book, he was talking about his grandmother. If you remember reading his book, he talked to her several times, and she would not want to share her feelings because they are not good feelings, and she'd rather not relive them. And he was frustrated trying to get her to speak about what it was like when she left. She just said, "I know life. I don't want to go back. It's no good. Bad times." And that was it. And she wouldn't elaborate on it. So he was able to do this with other people, Nick, in the neighborhood, and they kind of spoke willingly and told the stories. And about his photographs, so one day I was with him on Sheep Street. Nick, go back to that his book cover where he has the mailboxes. Yeah, it's on the cover of his book.
Yeah.
Well, we're in Sheep Street, he and I. This is one of his days we came walking around. So we go back to Sheep Street. It goes right back to that apartment. And I'm with him and I'm hanging out. And I lived on Sheep Street for a while and I'm looking at my own apartment, hanging out. And he's got his camera. These mailboxes are gone. Now they're all chrome, bronze, etc. And I said, well, this is perfect. That was then, this was now. And he must have spent 10 minutes in that little alcove taking a picture of those mailboxes. And I was like, what was he doing? It's just the mailbox, but he still spent on the new ones, which I never saw the new picture. But he spent trying to take the new ones. But in the meanwhile, I'm standing there just waiting for him to finish his photography. And out comes out of one of the apartments where I remember these, who said 40 kids in one building? They're running all over the street. When I lived there, you could throw a cannon down there and hit nobody. No, all of a sudden, talk about gentrification. All of a sudden, a guy comes out. He's got a skirt on. And I don't remember that 50 years ago, but now he's going to a wedding. He's dressed he's from Scotland, and he's got a Scottish skirt on. And Anthony's still taking pictures. He's not even paying attention. And I said, oh, wow, this was before and this was after. And then he says, going to a wedding. He's waiting for his Uber pickup. And next thing, 3 other guys come out of the apartment. So they're living there for the weekend to go to a wedding. And I said, boy, this is the before and this is the after. It was just so, it just hits you like crazy, that whole experience. But he spent more time in that mailbox.
So a quick story, if I may. You know, I was going to do it tonight, bring something, an artifact. It was really a fascinating artifact. So prior to my mother passing, several years ago, Anthony came to she was living in Winthrop. He said, Bobby, I want to interview your mother. I want to interview Anita and you. And my mother was in her 80s and she was kind of losing her memory. She couldn't remember exactly, some of the things. One of the stories that she told him, and I don't think was in this book, was a story when she was living on Fleet Street and the baker was downstairs. I think it may have been Manny's bakery. No, Fleet Street was Manny's too. It was Manny's, and there was, and my grandfather's baker, but she was, I'm sorry, I think this one was Manny's. So there was a gentleman from, East Boston who was kind of following her around. And for those of you who know my dad, 6'2", 250, huge guy. So, but he was, a teen then. And he said, Anita, is this gentleman bothering you? Do you want to go out with him? So she said, no, Charlie, I don't. So he said, I think you have to leave. And, he left. So at that moment, my mother explained to Anthony, he said, Anita, if you don't go out with that boy, would you mind going out with me? But here's the interesting part. After my mother passed, I was the executor of the will. And I found he left her a note. He wrote, and I still have it. I was going to bring it tonight. If it was in the book, I would have brought it. My father, from when he was like 18, that was, 90 years ago, and it said in here on the piece of bakery, and it's in a brown, I have it. If you don't go out with that boy, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to go. And I have that in handwritten. It's an amazing, amazing thing. I was going to bring it here, but it's an artifact, but he pulled that out of it. you know,
You didn't know that story until he.
no, I really didn't know that story. He pulled it out,
Yeah, right.
and then we find this,
Yeah.
you know, you know, and it would be if he to come here, because if I lost it, I would have been, my family members would have killed me. If I what?
If Anthony saw that note now, he'd go.
I know, it wasn't, yeah. He didn't, you know, it was difficult, and I know he had a lot to negotiate in the book and all. I mean, he spoke about these oral histories. I mean, since 1976 it started, you know, Jim, it started then, you know, with the gold mine idea. I mean, from my perspective, you know, this is surreal for me. You know, sitting down with a colleague in the 20s, coming in the North End, and, you know, trying to school him about, you know, being careful walking around with a camera, especially on Prince Street. You know, big problem. But that's the story. He did draw, and I mean, I was mesmerized on that roof. I don't know if one of my buddies, these guys that grew up with me, said, you know, Bob, we're gonna go on the roof. I'm gonna take some photos of it. Like, you kidding me, right? So,
I was just gonna say that even though I only sat in on one of these afternoons, I mean, it was several hours. There's some phrase that I'm not remembering, but he could get blood out of a stone. Isn't that a phrase? He just, and that's why I said he's actually a psychologist too, because I would like to be able to teach all our students how to do that. He just developed such a sense of relationship and listening and non-judgmental. A lot of trust that, I mean, that's why that one afternoon in Southington made such a big impression on me, because it just came. And, you know, I can imagine, yes, I know there are some really difficult stories of coming over or all sorts of the way people were treated, and no Irish need apply, no Italians need apply, you know, whatever. But I think that he could also get them to include some of those with the wonderful stories about food and family and, you know, building a church, you know, communities that built churches and stuff. So I think he could have a nice mixture of both. So yeah, he just did it. He just did it. I felt like I was with a master. I mean, it was.
And he taught himself.
Yeah.
Yes. He taught himself. Comment, question. I don't know if we can reach.
It's okay. I hate to.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. I just want to say something about Anthony. He transcends New England, just so you know. I'm from Pennsylvania, and my first event ever, the first time I ever met Anthony was actually at I Am Books' old location when my book came out. And Anthony was also presenting that night with me. And we just struck up a nice friendship that night. And I'm a younger author. I really didn't know too many people. I really didn't have the experience that he had. And he took me under his wing. And he helped me. He would tell me, like, maybe you want to try to do this with some of the local histories, or maybe this is a good idea for you. And he just always had this passion for what he's doing. Like, I can't go to the North End without thinking of Anthony. Anytime I've been to the North End since, and I always think of Anthony. Fortunately, up until the pandemic, I got to see him at Idea Boston or other things. The last time that we were in town, I remember walking in here. It was my first time in the new location, and there was From Italy to the North End, which was what he presented that day. And I started crying because I remembered just what an impact he has made on my life as an author and as a person just trying to write the Italian-American experience. He cared not just about New England, New Haven, the North End. He cared about all of Italian America, and he wanted to guide younger authors. And I do have one funny story. So if you've ever met my mother, which some of you in this room have, she's your tough Italian lady from Scranton, and you don't mess with Mama Wanda. Well, somehow they struck up this unique friendship where he is the only person on the planet and will remain the only person on the planet who can get away with calling her Scoochie. If I ever tried that, I would be killed. Anybody that we know ever tried that with her, because it's just the personality she has, there would be trouble. But somehow he said to her, Scoochie, and that was their name. Anytime they saw each other since that first day here at I Am Books, he referred to her as Scoochie. you a hug party. So that was his Anthony. So I want you all to know he transcends this area. He made a profound impact on my life.
You'll say he had connections with a group in Florida, or a school in Florida, doing Italian American studies, and then in California, Tommy. So he did have a lot of other connections.
Yeah, I just, will just make a comment on the cover of the book. So if you just want to thank you for placing that picture on the cover. Because all the time in the previous book, we would always look for that picture, all right? And that is right in the corner, all right? And that's Jane and Meat Market, and that's one of my close friends. I go, and they're not them, we were blessed. Blessed. That's my friend Danny, that's his uncle Nicky, and then the lady sitting right outside the meat store, that's my friend Carl Rafa. That was his grandmother, all right? So this picture, and like, I would hang out in this meat store constantly, you know, I'd always be there. And on Saturdays, we go by this store, I say, all right, come on, time for lunch. And we would go, I'd take my younger brother with me, and we would go to Angelo's on the corner of Margaret Street for the tripe. We get the tripe. So every Saturday, we get tripe and Angelo's, so we eat there and eat stuff. So the picture on the cover, thank you, whoever chose to
Oh,
put that
I'm
there.
sure that was Anthony.
Yeah,
He always had a list.
And well, that picture was inside the book all the time. So every time I would see Anthony's book, I'd be in Barnes and Nobles, whatever. I'd open it up and I'd look for that picture. Now I don't have to look. It's right there. I will. No, you're not gonna do that. But I gotta smuggle it in though.
Other questions or comments? How are you?
Hi, Jim. Well, my grandfather grew up on North Street, and he was a fisherman. And Anthony interviewed him for over an hour. And they laughed and joked, and it's one of my prized things that I own. It's a digital. Actually, I had him send the tape to me, the cassette. And I said, Anthony, you gotta change, these are gonna dissolve. So I did mine, and then I figured out how to tell him how to digitize all of this.
Which
So
he
it's a
did.
good thing.
He did them all.
Yeah, and so, yeah, I mean, that interview was great. He interviewed my grandfather, they talked about fishing. He got out of my grandfather, what if they had this at the time of Christ, and they interviewed Christ? He just talked about everything.
Did you know Anthony when he interviewed your grandfather, or you met him later?
No, but that's important because Grandpa came back and told me this guy interviewed me and made me get my recorder and record my grandfather. Now, he recorded him in English, and I got Sicilian out of my grandfather. I got, I said, English or Nepal, and he continued to speak Sicilian, but I like that now.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you got it.
So, oh, yeah, one more thing. So over the last 5 years, like he's probably talked about you, in talking about the Sicilian, how to write it and everything. You would think that he's writing a book about my grandfather. That's how special he made you feel. Like it was just about you guys.
Anthony did one other thing too. He actually found resources in Sicily. And he had his contacts with these people, and I got the name somewhere, but he'd call them so they could translate his tapes, because he wasn't sure if he always got the dialect correctly.
That guy was genius. It was right attached to the town.
Right, and he used them all the time to talk to them and get the translation, so he could get it in the book the right way.
And
It
he
took a
went
lot of work.
to Gloucester too, remember, to get the prayer, the Sicilian
Yeah.
prayer? He went to people in Gloucester, I mean, he didn't stop.
Yeah.
That kind of makes me think of one story that I always think about with Anthony. I never got to meet him in person, but I did work on his last 3 books. So we had a lot of emails, lots of phone calls. In between projects, he would send me pictures he'd taken at Yale. Hey, Jen, picture from Yale. Thanks, Anthony. He's like, got another book coming. Of course you do. But I always think, and I was just telling my husband about this story yesterday about when I was doing From Italy to the North End, and we had just printed it.
and Anthony had called, he was very anxious and upset because he had gotten someone's name wrong in the book. And from what I understood, this woman was in hospice, and he very much needed to fix the book right away, and he really needed to get her a copy and show her in person that he had fixed this and made it right. So we scrambled to get it fixed, get it to the printer. I think we had like 3 weeks, and within 2 weeks we got it fixed. We sent him new copies, and he called me. I think it was like she passed away, I think 2 days after he got to show her this book and said, look, I got it right. I fixed it for you and got it right. And I always think about that as that to me felt like that must have been quintessential Anthony.
Well,
He
exactly,
really
yes.
wanted to get this right and make sure she knew this was important, that I made it right for you. And I was really glad that I got to be part of that, of making that right for him.
But you see, it made you care about it
He
too.
made me
That's
care about
the
it a
part of it,
lot.
you know?
And I worked, I met him when we started working on farms, factories, and families, and I just enjoyed working with him. He was so excited about what he was doing. And then when his next book came through, I remember telling James immediately, like, I want that. I want Anthony's book. And then the next one, it was just like, of course I'm getting Anthony's book. And he was already talking to me about it before he's like, it's coming. And I'm like, when? It's May, dude. When is it coming? He's like, it's coming. I'm like, okay. And I knew eventually I would get it. And so he's like, we need to have a conversation on the phone. I'm like,
That's
"Well,
Anthony.
we're gonna talk." I loved working with Anthony. He was a great person to work with, despite not being able to meet him in person. He was a presence. I am really grateful to have worked with him.
So intense.
He was. Yeah.
Well, I always felt a very special connection to Anthony from the time we presented together, and always stayed in touch because my family on 2 sides came from the North End. I went through Italy, North End, and then East Pasto. And my dad, grew up here in a family of 13 kids in Thatcher Street, and had a dry cleaning business at 436 Commercial. So I had bought some of his early books and actually gave a talk at a museum on him and his photography down in Connecticut. And I always felt it just a really special connection to him because in the scholarly world, he was unusual because he had so much heart and he wore his heart here. And so it made it very easy to connect with him. Because you felt his honesty, his truthfulness, his integrity. I mean, it was always present. It didn't matter how deep or shallow the conversation was. He was always incredibly present. And I think that's the most beautiful thing that we get as a gift from him, the scholarship, the photographs, to understand that that integrity comes through, and it comes through in the story that you told. So thank you so much for organizing this. It's really special to have Iron Books here as the center, have you, the Historical Association, to have all of you here. It's really wonderful. Thank you.
Anthony's enthusiasm was just contagious.
Yeah.
And you could not like him.
Right.
He was just the sweetest guy. He really was. And you felt like other people have said that you were special to him because he had a way of making the people that he knew special.
Yeah, exactly. He didn't move his driving.
Yeah. You would aggravate. He would always, I get an email from Jim, you gotta read this, and it would be in pages. And I said, Anthony, I can't read pages, it's in a PDF. And again and again, Madonna, Anthony, I can't read it. I send him his emails. He gets so excited, he will forget.
Yeah, he's even driving me crazy now. So I'll be there, don't worry. Okay.
I just wanted to say that what I feel Anthony gave to me personally, when I grew up in the North End, growing up all our lives in the North End, don't forget, when we were kids, I can remember the nun said to me, well, you just live in the ghetto. I said, ghetto what? This isn't a ghetto. but that's how they thought about it. But when I brought from Italy to the North End, see, my kids grew up in the North End, but they grew up in a different culture in the North End. And so they didn't realize what we went through, but what, like he said about his father, if you talk about him, he's still here. If we have the pictures
Yes.
and we have the interviews, those years are still here.
Yes.
Exactly, yep.
Exactly.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, you got the other ones.
Well, I wanted to thank everyone again. It's been incredibly moving, touching. It's I think such a privilege for those who have met him, but also those who have not met him in person, but who have been touched. And again, for me, it was very important to do this at the bookstore where he came several times, and where we were talking about this book. We were talking about the launch of this book, and we were saying you are going to come here. And unfortunately, we can't have him here, but we can have his book, and this book lives on forever. And not only this book, but the other books also that he has written. And it's just a treasure that really is invaluable. So thank you again, everybody, for coming. We have all of his books. We have also the North End Historical Society to thank for tonight's event. Tommy, Jim, thank you so much for helping and for organizing this together. And
People to join the North End.
yes,
We want to bring this
please join the
story
North End
and keep it
Historical
alive.
Society, because this is really about preserving history. It's what Anthony did and what he really wanted. And hopefully we can bring, some of his archives here too, right?
That's what our plan is.
We're working
Yep.
on it.
Make some
Right, Tom?
exhibits, yep.
Yeah, putting the pressure on you. Well, thank you again, and have a great night.